This Viking sword was made from steel that Europe wasn't supposed to have for another 800 years. Here's what you're actually looking at. Buried among thousands of ordinary Viking Age weapons, roughly 170 swords have turned up bearing the same strange inscription along the blade. The name, Ulfbert, forged in iron letters right into the steel. On the surface, they look like any other Viking sword. Underneath, there's something else entirely. The inscription itself is oddly precise. It always follows a similar pattern. A cross, the name, another cross, inlaid directly into the metal rather than simply scratched onto the surface afterward. Whoever made these swords wanted that name permanently fused into the blade, not just stamped on for show. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. Most Viking Age swords were made from bloomery iron, a soft, impure metal hammered and folded over and over just to make it usable in battle. The Ulfbert swords weren't. Lab analysis has found their blades were forged from crucible steel, with carbon content around 1 to 1.2%, nearly 3 times higher than anything else being made in Europe at the time. Think about what that actually requires. To purify iron into steel that clean, you need a furnace hot enough to fully liquefy the metal, somewhere around 1,650 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt the impurities completely out, leaving behind steel that's stronger, more flexible, and holds an edge far better than anything else on a Viking Age battlefield. Here's the problem. European furnaces at the time weren't capable of reaching that temperature. Not even close. The technology to consistently produce crucible steel simply didn't exist in Western Europe during the Viking Age. So where did it actually come from? Most researchers now trace the answer eastward, along trade routes stretching through Central Asia, Persia, and India, where crucible steel production, sometimes called Wootz steel, had already existed for centuries. The leading theory is that Viking traders acquired raw ingots of this steel through the Volga trade route, moving it thousands of kilometers from its origin through Khazaria and the Caspian region before it ever reached a Frankish or Norse forge. But wait, here's where it gets genuinely strange. That means a sword found buried in a Scandinavian grave may contain steel that started its journey on the other side of the known world, passed through multiple trading cultures, and ended up hammered into a weapon by someone who may never have understood exactly what made the metal so unusual. The Vikings weren't just raiders working with what was locally available. They were operating inside a genuinely global supply chain, centuries before anyone would casually use that phrase. Modern blacksmiths have tried to settle whether this was even achievable using period-accurate methods. One well-documented replication attempt took over a week of forging work, including roughly 11 straight hours just pounding a single crucible steel ingot into a workable blade shape. The final sword held an edge and flexibility that matched original Ulfbert specimens closely. So the technique itself wasn't impossible. It was simply extraordinarily difficult and required knowledge most European smiths at the time didn't have access to. Even with modern tools, modern furnaces, and a known recipe to follow, it still took an experienced blacksmith the better part of a week to pull off successfully. So consider what that leaves you with. A weapon marked with a single consistent name, made from imported steel, most local smiths couldn't have sourced or worked with alone, appearing across a scattered handful of graves and riverbeds from Scandinavia all the way down to Spain. Whoever controlled this technique controlled something rare enough that only a small, elite circle of warriors ever carried it. Many Ulfbert swords have been recovered bent or deliberately broken, not from battle damage, but from ritual destruction. Norse burial customs sometimes involved symbolically killing a prized weapon before burial, bending or snapping the blade so it could accompany its owner into the afterlife without falling into the hands of a random grave robber. A sword valuable enough to import steel for, valuable enough to inscribe with a name, was also valuable enough to deliberately destroy rather than let it end up in the wrong hands. Now hold that against how quickly this advantage eventually disappeared. As crucible steel techniques and trade access spread more widely across medieval Europe, the exclusivity of the genuine Ulfbert faded. Cheaper, lower quality imitations bearing the same inscriptions started appearing, made from ordinary iron by smiths, simply copying the name without the metallurgy behind it. The brand outlived the secret. Eventually, nobody carrying an Ulfbert blade could be entirely sure whether they held a genuine piece of imported crucible steel or a convincing forgery riding on someone else's reputation. So the next time you hear Viking Age and picture crude iron axes and rough-hewn wooden shields, remember what was quietly moving through Norse hands at the very same time. Not a myth, not a folk legend. A documented, laboratory-confirmed piece of medieval steel that shouldn't have existed in Europe for another 800 years, carried across a trade network spanning half the known world, and eventually broken on purpose so it could follow its owner into the next one.